everyone. My name is Yi Shi, and I'm a venture fellow at Newchip. First of all, thank you for choosing to watch this panel today, as we are going to talk about one of the most exciting topics in the startup world, cannabis. I am personally very interested in this field because I am myself a beneficiary of CBD due to my lupus condition. Recently, more and more states and countries are legalizing marijuana, which used to be a very strict Schedule I drug, along with heroin, LSD, and even ecstasy. This obviously creates some opportunities for startups and investors to follow. Therefore, today we invited 3 experts in the field to share their experience and knowledge about the future of cannabis innovation. Without further ado, let's go ahead and let them introduce themselves to the audience. John, would you mind taking the lead?
Absolutely. Thank you, Yishi. Appreciate it. My name is John Basar, and I'm a co-founder and CEO of WaxNax. We're an ancillary packaging and filling service in the THC and CBD concentrate space. We're based out of Denver, Colorado, and we are currently now reaching in other markets. And again, very excited to be on the panel. And here's some of the interesting things Ted and Elaine have to offer.
Awesome. Thank you. Next, we have Ted, who is an experienced investor and advisor in the cannabis field. Ted, please go ahead.
Sure. So I'm a former securities lawyer turned entrepreneur, investor, and advisor. I've been working in the cannabis space for, I guess, about 6 or 7 years. At first, really all picks and shovels and sort of plant adjacent type activities, nothing that was plant touching. But in the last couple of years, as we've seen, the path toward legalization moving forward and legalization in some states, we've gotten into more, plant touching type things, both from like the investor and advisor side. And I'm also one of the founders of Alma Healing, which is a hemp-based wellness brand that does CBD and other cannabinoids.
Awesome, thank you. Last but not least, we have Elaine, who is the founder of My Cure All. Elaine, please.
Hi, how are you? So I'm Elaine Richer, and I am actually a pharmacist, a legal pharmacist in both New Jersey and Florida. I've been a pharmacist for over 25 years. I've worked in 3 Fortune 500 companies. I was a district manager in CVS, Rite Aid, and Walgreens. I worked with a lot of pharmacists, led a lot of teams, definitely did a lot of really cool things with, with PBMs, with the way the healthcare has been changing, especially as a landscape in the last few years. About 1.5 years ago, I left my position and I became a CEO of My Cure All. So I'm a founder and a CEO of My Cure All. We consider ourselves as a cannabis benefit manager. We look to reduce really healthcare costs and expenditures by providing optimal medical cannabis protocols and treatments for patients with really this very heavy patient-centric approach. We have that ecosystem that connects providers, patients, med treatment, because we are looking into a lot of assistance for opioid use disorders, as well as insurance companies. So what we developed is an app that combines all 4, that puts everybody in touch with each other. And we're trying to work out this hand-in-hand natural solution for the medical conditions that cannabis is indicated for.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elaine. Thank you, everybody, for the introduction. So let's kick in the topics today. My first question for you guys would be, what are some trends in the cannabis industry right now, and any interesting innovations or developments that are worth noticing? What are our consumers looking for as well? Feel free to jump in if you want to talk about it right now.
Sure. There's a couple that I can talk about. 2 of the things that I find most exciting would be the rise of food and beverage in cannabis, and then also beginning to incorporate more like genetics and personalized medicine into people's cannabis experience. I'll start with the second one. So, for the last few years, in addition to the work I do in cannabis, I've been doing work with precision medicine and longevity and anti-aging and things like that. And really just asking the question of how can we utilize an individual's DNA to do, therapy or treatment for them, right? And we've learned so much about how individuals are all unique and how there are different, supplements, nutrition protocols, things for different people based on their genetics, right? And when it comes to cannabis, so far we've really had this one size fits all approach. We've had this approach where you walk into a store or you go online, and the way that you determine what product you're going to buy oftentimes is like what the person who works there enjoys themselves, or you buy it based on the label, which happens more often than I think we'd like to admit. And that really is not taking, the individual's genetics into account. And there's a really wide variety of responses to cannabinoids that we can have based on, a few key genes. There's about 55 genes that we found, implicated in cannabinoid responses. There's about 16 that we found like really tight correlations with. And so part of the work that we're doing and that others are doing that I think is really interesting is sequencing an individual's genetics and then manufacturing products specific to them, or at least recommending products that are specific to them with different THC to CBD ratios, different minor cannabinoid ratios, different terpenes and things like that, based on the individual. And so I think this personalization is one of the things that's really going to be required for the industry to mature and grow up a little bit. And that's one that I'm really excited for. And then the rise in food and beverage is another one that I think is really exciting. It used to be that when people had, like THC edibles or CBD edibles, the taste and flavor and the presentation really was not of prime importance. It was really all about effect. And for a long time, it was like, how much THC, can we pack into this, right? How high are we going to get people in huge dosages of CBD and things? And what I found, especially in the last years, there are people who are pioneering really like food and flavor first approaches that also happen to have, THC or CBD in them. But first and foremost, it has to be delicious, right? It has to have good mouthfeel and things like that. And so I think that's an area where we've seen a lot of development is having products that just really taste good, that people enjoy eating and drinking, that also happen to have, these cannabinoids in them, and lower dosages too. I mean, for a long time, we were seeing a lot of THC products in legal states with 100 milligrams, 300 milligrams of THC, which for the uninitiated, or even for those of us who are more cannabis experienced, is really overwhelming. And now we're seeing, 1, 2, 3 milligram as well becoming very popular. So I think, lower dosages are another trend that I think is pretty interesting. And on the beverage side, that's really what I've been focusing on for the past year or so with our company, Alma Healing. We have a product called Elevate, which is designed as an alcohol alternative. And I think that's one of the trends that we're seeing as well, is people using cannabis and hemp products as an alternative to alcohol, because you can get the same relaxing, unwinding kind of feeling that you get from your favorite alcoholic beverage, but without a lot of negative health consequences of alcohol that I think, we're all familiar with. So that's one that I'm really excited to see, growing as well as supplanting of alcohol with cannabis products.
Awesome. Yes, I remember right now, even Netflix has a cooking show just about how to infuse cannabis into different type of high-end cuisine as well. So I can see the trend on there, like you said, Tad. How about other people feeling about that?
Well, if I can go next. So I really enjoyed, hearing Ted speak about genomes and really personalized medicine, because that's a very important subject. And I believe it works as a pharmacist throughout for every medication. And we all notice this. We all know we're individuals. We all look at the side effects of, one of us will get a side effect to a COVID shot. The other one wouldn't, right? Different side effects. We all react differently. So the same goes with cannabis. And I am really, it was considered innovative to think about it from any medication standpoint. And the fact that we're thinking about it right at the get-go, right as cannabis, hopefully being considered to be legal very shortly, federally, it's really, really a very cool, it's a very cool thing. So I think it's very important. And we're taking it a little bit further. So we're looking at protocols. And the way we're looking at protocols, not every cannabis product is, cannabis, it can be used for everything. So we're looking at specific cannabis for specific patient and for their specific need. And that's kind of what, that's one of the things that we're doing. And I do believe this is a full future, because if you have a migraine versus somebody that's struggling with HIV wasting disease, you need different strains of cannabis simply because you're treating different conditions. And that's something that I really see is being looked at from any standpoint of, a physician and a patient. You see a lot of patients are talking about, okay, so I'm suffering with anxiety and I can't sleep at night. What is the best strain that I can use? So I think that's definitely becoming a very something that people are concentrating on. And the next thing I think that the other thing is important in the trend is really going through that medical coverage, because cannabis is very expensive, and the trial and error method is very expensive, and people can't afford it. And you really should not be choosing food or your medication, right? That goes for everything. So that's pretty much kind of where I see a very important trend. There've been, 3 cases in the country where we now have workers' compensation programs that are actually paying for cannabis. New Jersey, where I'm from, is being one of those. Workers' compensation actually being that cannabis is medically acceptable in the state. Workers' compensation now has to cover cannabis. And I think that's a very important way of kind of where we're moving as a society. And that's very cool to see.
Yes. I still remember when I drove to Colorado, I still need to actually get the cash to purchase the cannabis right now. And then hopefully the banking system will open with more and more states getting more regulated as well. So John, what's your thought on this?
Yeah, I mean, great thoughts, Ted and Elaine. I think you guys really hit on some probably the biggest factors in cannabis right now that we see a lot of growth. For me, overall, Ted mentioned it, ancillary and non-touching plant, those are simultaneously can be used together. That's where I see a lot of potential growth and trends in cannabis. We saw the crash of the cannabis market due to an oversupply of cannabis. When a lot of people think of cannabis right off the top, they think, all right, well, I'm going to go out to Colorado, Oregon, wherever. I'm going to buy land. I'm going to set up a grow and I'm going to grow my own cannabis. Right now, what we're seeing is there's an oversupply of that. It's very high capital expenditure to start. So really where I think there's a huge opportunities is on the ancillary side. And again, Ted touched up on it, Elaine touched up on it, being able to specifically, formulate strains that help with specific things. I don't know if you guys have heard of Delta 8. That is a very large, very growing section of cannabis that's exploding. I see in Colorado right now. And again, that's similar to the Delta 9 structure, tweaked a little bit, called Delta 8, and now not as much psychoactive effect as Delta 9. And so now people are using it for, their specific reasonings where they don't want to have, as much psychoactive effects come into play. And so overall, again, ancillary is where I see a big kind of push the industry is moving towards. I mean, specifically when, for example, there's so many different ways you can look at marketing companies in the cannabis industry. Like I love that type of service in the industry because there's so many hurdles, so many hula hoops you got to jump through in cannabis just to market. You can't use Facebook, you can't use Google. So those type of companies coming in and helping, just that's one example where I think there's a lot of benefit moving forward. And again, really where there's going to be a lot of space to grow in the industry.
Yes. Like John said, I heard about that as well. And then I feel very interesting. I think from what you guys mentioned, it's really a lot of personalization and also very specific content, try to extract, just depend on different people's genetics as well, will be very a big trend right now. Even if I heard right now my cat, they try to advertise certain pet CBD product to me as well, since I'm buying a lot of food for my cat online. So I think the pet CBD product will be on the trend as well. Awesome. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I had a question for Ted real quick, just because Ted, you had experience both in the, ancillary non-touching part of the plant and as well as touching of the plant industries. Kind of what did you, working on both sides, what did you see? Were you more excited about one over the other? I was just curious to see. Again, I've been solely in ancillary, focused on ancillary businesses. So I'm wondering, kind of how you weighed the two.
Yeah. So I think, early on, we went the ancillary route because, we were concerned about the risk of plant touching, right?
Exactly.
6 or 7 years ago, things looked very different than they do now. And so, my background was in software. I built a software company, a SaaS company. And so it was a place where I thought I could add value. Like, I was a personal consumer of cannabis. I had this background. And so I thought I could merge the two together, right? And so looking at things like, what are CRMs going to be? How are we doing seed to sale tracking? I've got, a sort of long time background in blockchain and cryptocurrency, going back a good number of years. And so figuring out how do we do like blockchain based tracking of these things. And so it was a lot of just like merging of different fields that I was interested in, right? And one that was sort of risk mitigated. And the people who were in the industry at the time, it was a lot more like kind of, white shoe, like more like Wall Street, types that were doing ancillary. And the traditional market was still very much underground, sort of like the classic Humboldt hippie, right? And so, then as things became more and more destigmatized and, de-risked and it became legal in certain states, that's when I became more interested in things that, were plant touching, right? And for a long time, I wasn't really doing anything, on the THC side. I thought, I've really been interested from the health perspective, right? And on the THC side, it's like, you smoke pot to get high, right? But most people aren't using it for the health perspective. Like, you would be using a much lower THC containing product. So I was more in the hemp side of things. And, at first, again, it was like a lot of wellness entrepreneurs and people are coming out of like the supplement and nutraceutical space. But now, we're seeing the same thing. Like, it's big business and it's big money now. And there's this sort of green rush that's happening. And so again, it's becoming more professionalized. We're seeing the same, kind of white shoe bankers coming in that, come in as industries mature a bit. So, my shift was really just like a personal thing, but I think it's still interesting because, there's a place for everyone to fit in, right? Like, if you're someone who's a personal consumer of cannabis or you think it's important as medicine or as an alternative to traditional pharma, and you're like someone with a tech background, ancillary might be, the thing for you, right? Like, I have a friend who's a nuclear engineer who's, devising extraction machines, right? Which I think is really cool. Whereas if people are more interested in, the plant, then I think, part of the problem with the plant touching side is, like you said, it's becoming so commoditized now. And so many people are coming into the space thinking it's going to be easy. And while it's not that difficult to grow cannabis, it is really difficult to do it consistently, across multiple years and turn out consistent product. And so, I think a lot of people trying to rush in will be a little bit really surprised. And we're also seeing just a lot of consolidation in the space in general, people taking advantage of economy of scale and rolling up smaller brands and things. So, my hope is that we have sort of two markets on the plant touching side, or maybe even three. One is sort of like the pure medical, kind of side, which takes a sort of like reductionist approach down to single compounds. Then we have sort of like the wellness, side of things, and like an alternative to traditional pharma. And then hopefully we'll also see just like an artisanal market, for people to experiment with interesting, formulations and plant genetics and things to produce some cool results. So I think there's interesting things that are happening across the board. It just depends on where you think you fit in and what your interests are.
Definitely. I love that you brought up software. I think that's only one thing that's just scratching the surface. In any industry, everything's coming down to data. And obviously, the more data you can collect, you can use for medical, prescriptions, whatever it may be. Again, that's what you guys are doing with My Cure All, using the software. So I think that's another area where there's a lot of tremendous opportunity in the software. Again, accumulation of data to help, help users make the right choice for, whatever their ailment is.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for your answers. So now when it comes to marijuana, we have to talk about legal. So I think New Jersey is the recent state to legalize recreational weed. But in the meantime, there's a rumor that our current federal government will follow the suit very soon. We don't know when, but there's a little bird speaking. What are some regulation challenges for our startups now, even though so many good news and so many good things are happening? Also, is the public ready for this, right? Because to me, for example, who is born and raised in a traditional Chinese family, marijuana is actually like a taboo to my parents' generation as well. What are your thoughts? Any suggestions, especially Tad, you as a legal background as well? What are some indications we are facing right now?
Yeah, so, on sort of like the legal challenge front or challenges in general, I think the most obvious one is banking, right?
Yes.
That's a big problem. I mean, there's still a lot of, dispensaries that are cash only. And, I don't know if you've seen like old banks are being bought up because they have vault in them and being turned into, dispensaries because they need somewhere to store all of the cash, right? And I think that's, it's a shame that things exist that way. And so I think, cannabis compliant banking is something that we're going to see, happening pretty quickly. I know a couple of people who are working on it right now. Some of the banks will start offshore and service US customers. And then as we see federal legalization happening, we'll bring them onshore and that'll be something happening there. But that's, I think one of the most obvious ones. And then there's, another challenge, which is just like a lack of clarity and uncertainty, around certain laws. Like, right now, I think people could argue that you should not be allowed to sell CBD products, period, because, GW Pharmaceuticals has the patent for Epidiolex. And, so there's this whole like drug ingredient question, right? But I think we understand it's not an enforcement priority. So you have this tension where something is not legal, but also not an enforcement priority, sort of leaves you in this lurch where you're probably not going to have anyone come after you unless you're, making false claims and things. But it still doesn't feel great to know that, you're not complying with the letter of the law, right? When you're doing your best to do so. And I think that's the challenge, is a company that wants to do everything right at this point in time cannot do it. There are no definitive rules, for them to follow, right? And that's problematic. We want to have a path for people who want to do things right, and a path for prosecuting those who don't, right? So I think that's one of the big ones. Another big challenge is just the inconsistency state by state. Some states allow for you to use CBD as a food ingredient or food additive, and some don't, right? If you're, like everything is online now, right? Brands are not geographically limited. You want to be able to sell across the entire country and ship across the entire country, and having this patchwork framework of different rules, I think, is a challenge as well. With federal legalization, hopefully that will change too, and states will follow suit and, adopting whatever the federal rules are. So I think that kind of covers the challenges. In terms of, is the public ready? I mean, the answer is both, right? So on one hand, the public is absolutely ready because the types of products that are available for dealing with their health concerns now are not nearly as good as what a lot of these cannabis products can be, right? I mean, yeah. I've seen recent studies showing that, blends of CBD and minor cannabinoids and curcumin derived from turmeric root was far more effective than the classic drugs for rheumatoid arthritis, right? And there's a number of examples of this where people are ditching their, prescriptions and using cannabis because it gives them the same effect with fewer side effects, right? I'm not saying anyone should stop taking their meds, and obviously you want to consult with your doctor, but that is real and that is happening, right? So I'd say not only are they ready, but they're desperate for alternative solutions that are going to be a really good fit for them. And then there's the destigmatization piece, like you talked about your family, not being comfortable with cannabis. And I think that's just something that is going to change over time. Whenever something is new and it has a lot of stigma built up around it, it's going to take time for that to dissolve away. I think the more people learn about like the roots of cannabis prohibition, the more they realize that a lot of it is actually grounded in like xenophobia and racism against certain groups that were cultivating it, over the course of the last 100 years. And when we recognize that, that's the root of a lot of these policies have this really racist tone, it'll allow us to evolve much faster beyond it, right? And the more we take this sort of science and fact-based approach, again, the more people will begin to move beyond it, right? The more people's doctors, suggest it to them, the more that we'll begin to see it incorporated. And, cannabis has a place like in ancient Chinese medicine and Ayurveda, and a few traditional kind of medical cultures that we've seen lost because of like the illegality and the stigmatization. I think now we're going to see it swing back the other way and see, practitioners of these healing arts begin to incorporate them more and more again, begin to read back to, notes of people who they've learned from, like over, a couple thousand years, right? In certain cases of these historical traditions of using the plant. So I'm excited to see, how that plays out as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Ted. And also, Elaine, as a pharmacist as well, what's your thoughts on this?
So I can start with Stigma. First of all, I do agree with everything that Ted mentioned. And I know that there are a number of companies in California that are working on credit card processing, that are working on different, banking, assisting with banking regulations. And obviously, as soon as cannabis will become federally legal, that's something that's going to change very swiftly because all the big banks will want to get into it. I'm a pharmacist. I am a very straight arrow. The fact that I started talking about cannabis in the first place was a shock to everyone around me several years ago. So I can tell you that, the only thing I knew about cannabis was the smells on the streets of Greenwich Village, when I was in college. That was pretty much it. And it was just, permeating every street corner. And that was pretty much all I was aware of. But as I started reading and I've heard a report on television and then I started looking at it and I saw the big difference that cannabis brings versus opioids. And I saw the ability for something that's non-addictive to be that perfect opioid replacement therapy. That became to me really a mantra. I was just out of pharmacy school when OxyContin came out. And I remember those, sales reps going and asking you, please order one bottle. We'll send you one bottle for free. Please, order, will get you a $150 rebate check for this. So, this doctor will not prescribe it unless you keep the medication in stock and all of this stuff. And it's interesting. So I was kind of like right there seeing how, doctors were prescribing, patients were using and getting addicted just like that. So, I mean, if we were able to believe that OxyContin helps us, I think pretty much the herb that's been out there for as long as planet has been around and the endocannabinoid system that's been evolving for 500 million years kind of should be an easier thing to believe in. That's, I do believe education is very important. Educating physicians, because a lot of physicians, only 7% of medical schools actually touch upon endocannabinoid system. I now read lectures regularly in the pharmacy school I went to, LIU, on endocannabinoid system and on cannabis, because it's not something that was taught. It's not something that people know of. So, and we all have a tendency to be afraid, of things we don't know. So I think that's going to go a long way, and it's going to go a long way very quickly because you see all these programs are popping up in colleges, in medical schools, and pharmacy schools. It really is, interesting how it's becoming all over the place. Everybody's talking about research. If not prescribing and recommending, they're at least talking about research, right? So I do think it's becoming more acceptable. From the regulation standpoint, I believe that becomes very different, and not only from state to state and town to town, but from a dispensary to a dispensary. There's really no good manufacturing practices. You really don't know what product you're getting. You're getting exactly what they have on the shelf right now at that moment that you came into the dispensary. There are a lot of issues. I'm on the East Coast, obviously. We have a shortage of product, and we have a lack of different cannabis strains. And that's a very big problem for patients. So even when we're, for example, like I'm now working on protocols and designing protocols, I have to say that, okay, if the dispensary doesn't have this product, then you can then the patient can go to this product. But it really shouldn't be this way. I mean, when the doctor sends you to the pharmacy with a prescription for amoxicillin, you go with a prescription for amoxicillin, you're not expecting to have ampicillin substituted for it, right? Because it's going to work differently. And that's exactly what's happening right now, at least on the East Coast. I know the West Coast dispensaries, and depending on the state, that really is different. So I believe that's important. The quality of the product that's being grown is very important, and the quality suffers a lot. And I can tell you, even in New Jersey, now that we are recreational, we're not going to see recreational for a while because we can't really manage the need of the medical patients right now. The medical patients are not getting the product that they need. So how can we possibly go to sell recreational? if we can't address the need of the patient. So I think that really should be a very big area of concentration on the road, is really, having enough product, having the right product, and having the good manufacturing practices. You need to make sure that you're really getting the product from the place where you can trust how it was grown, how it was packaged, how it was given to you. All the stuff, I think it's becomes very, very important.
Yes. Thank you, Elaine. A standardization, just a little bit, a standard of manufacturing process and ingredients, I think will be important moving forward as well. Thank you. John, any input on this?
Yeah, Yishi, very similar to you, Yi. My parents, immigrants from Turkey, so very much conservative, have, didn't know too much about the plant until I got involved in the industry. And so I think with destigmatization, the only way we'll get past it is by federally opening it up to the country, because that way we're going to be able to flow in the amount of education and information that is needed. We're no longer going to keep information in the dark and, produce misinformation. It's all going to be standardized, checked through, make sure it's correct, and backed up on. And so that's one piece that I really look forward to in legalization, is now we can really strongly and have resources to educate the country as a whole, and even internationally as a whole, on, again, the real power of the plant. I mean, you asked, do you think the country's ready? I think the country's been ready for legalization. I think you look at the opioid crisis that Elaine was mentioning. I think that's a clear indication that the country is ready. Again, Ted mentioned it. The reason there is this dark stigma around cannabis, unfortunately tied to, political games and, race issues, social issues, that people tied into cannabis to, put down groups, individuals, people's races. So it's, it's nasty stuff what happened in the future. And again, I think the more education we can bring, and again, I think the more education we can bring is through legalization throughout the country. So I think we're ready. I think we've been ready. I think it needs to happen, obviously, in the right way. We take care of some of the black market problems that we have from state to state. Ted mentioned it, some of the problems we're seeing right now with cannabis, from state to state, it's so different. In Colorado, there's no need for a distributor to get your product in the stores. In California, that's the only way you can do it. And so it's tough to juggle these different loopholes, these different, problems. And that's blessing, also a tough thing, while you're in the industry. It's you're dealing with these different problems that other industries don't deal with. And so, I mean, really, I think you look at it and you see, again, there's people that are dealing with different issues in different states. We can kind of streamline it ideally with federal legalization. That's kind of where we need to go. Hopefully, again, we see that happening now.
Yes, great. Very useful information from you guys. I agree as well. I think maybe the country is actually ready. It just needs a process in place, some discussion in place, and really we need to get hands on it and really just go through the process. So this is all very useful information, and all leads to my last question for you guys today. What will be your prediction for the industry in the next 2 or 3 years? Also, what will be the fundraising outlook for our startups in the cannabis industry in general? Any other potential resources they can look for as well? Feel free to jump in.
I can talk. I think the future is regulation. I do believe that everybody is going to jump on board, taxation, regulation, making sure that, everybody gets a piece of the action from the state and federal government standpoint. But I do think, as I mentioned before, the good manufacturing practices is something that's very important for the patient, first and foremost. And I do think that's something that needs to be enforced, and the only way it can be enforced and will be enforced is when the states are fully involved. And it is very different from, state by state. I am in the state, I'm in New Jersey, where at this point have only 9 dispensaries. There's a bunch coming up, but we have only 9. And they're all vertical licenses. So they are growing, distributing, and selling. So you don't have individual licenses. You can't have a storefront without having a grow, which is now changing. So that's, I think, is a big, it's very important. That regulation, I think it's going to be very, very important, become very important. because as I said, I'm looking at it from the medical standpoint, but even if you're using it recreationally, you do want to make sure that you're getting a clean, good product that's not laced with anything, right?
Yes.
And that was grown without mold, and that's something that's a good product for you. So I think that's a big thing coming. And I also feel the future is for medical is insurance coverage, which is why I kind of got into this from the startup standpoint. I think insurance coverage is very important. As we mentioned before, cannabis is very expensive. People have to try different products. They have to try different dosage forms. And it's very important that the insurance covers it when it's being used for medical reasons. If OxyContin can cost, upward $4,000 a month, depending on the strength, and the insurance company is paying for it, why can't the insurance company cover cannabis that's a lot cheaper, doesn't cause the same, will not put that patient into a rehab facility for which the insurance company will have to pay, and, cause side effects and drug interactions. So I think that's the future. I really hope so. And obviously I'm banking my future on it as well. But I certainly believe that that's very important.
Yes. Thank you, Elaine. Any other people?
Yeah, I think on the funding piece of it. So I personally, we're fundraising currently right now, and kind of the trend I've seen is, Ted mentioned these white shoes investment bankers, kind of getting in the space right now. It's there's definitely some hurdles in getting some of these traditional VC funds to invest in cannabis. It's not an area they're too well versed in, and for a lot of them, they don't feel that comfortable diving in with with 2 feet. Obviously, there are some specific cannabis firms. I probably know about 50 off top, but again, obviously, as the floodgates open, more and more VCs, more and more institutional investors are going to dive in and want to get a piece of the action. I do think a lot of that's going to be funneled to the ancillary side of things, as I think, again, in software, like we mentioned with Ted, medical, pharmaceutical, I think those are going to be areas where these VCs have a little bit more experience and knowledge with, so they may kind of signal in and look for those opportunities. I think right now, one piece that even my team's looking at is crowdfunding. I think that kind of allows entrepreneurs to voice their brand, to really put it out there online, and let the people kind of decide how much it's worth, how much they should be given. And so that's something we've been looking into. I advise, again, if VCs are again kind of putting up some block holds, look at these crowdfunding opportunities that allow you to kind of really showcase your brand and drive in some fundraising that way.
Yes. Thank you, John. Ted, any thoughts on this?
I mean, I think you guys hit the big ones, right? Like having a basic floor of regulation, I think is really important, and we'll see happen more and more, right? Having it be legitimized as real medicine is one that I think we're going to see more and more. On the investment front, I think, John is exactly right. I think a lot of the traditional capital is going to flow into ancillary or, manufacturing equipment and things like that, not as much into plant touching, because I don't think that part of the industry really needs that much capital. And so I think that's interesting. And I think equity crowdfunding is an excellent point. That's something that I've personally done a lot of, and I think is really interesting and really democratizes finance in a way that we haven't seen before, and gives people the ability to invest in vehicles that, while higher risk, are also potentially much higher reward, and things that have only been available to accredited investors so far. I think is really an interesting trend. And then on the investment front, I'm really optimistic about the industry and people's ability to raise capital. I think that in 2019, so much money came into the space so quickly with so little due diligence. There was this green rush, and people were so excited to get in, that a lot of investors were burned and invested in companies that were not ready for funding or should not have been funded. And so I think, in 2020, we saw people kind of taking a step back and saying, okay, let's let things, settle out a little bit. Now, fortunately, there's cannabis investor syndicates that I think are doing a really good job. There's groups like ArcView, which is a cannabis investor network that, I'm a big fan of, that is helping to do diligence on deals and teach investors how to responsibly deploy capital in the space. And so I think the more education is done, and the more professional, events there are for family office investors and pension funds about how do you actually start investing in cannabis, the comfort level will start to come back. And I think it's happening already. So overall, I'm optimistic about the prospects for investment in the space. And if we see federal legalization, I mean, game on, it's really going to explode.
Yes. Thank you guys so much for sharing your knowledge today. Our discussion is coming to the end. In conclusion, we just wish more and more people will learn and feel the benefits of cannabis, and share the positivity and the good energy as well with our community. Really appreciate your time today on behalf of our Newchip community. Thank you very much for your contribution, and until next time.